Hello everyone, I'm Golden Sound, you're watching The Headphone Show by Headphones.com, and I did not think that I would be talking about MQA again, but it is back. With some new marketing, some new promises, but is it actually different or is it just the same stuff with new names? Well, let's talk about what's happening with MQA and then test some of the new stuff. Now, if you've been in the audio hobby for a while, or if you've seen my original video, which is also linked in the description, then you probably know about the history of MQA. But for those unfamiliar, here's a very quick recap. MQA, or Master Quality Authenticated, was a product developed by Meridian. Originally, when it first launched, the premise of MQA was that it was able to store high-res digital audio, up to 192 kHz, in a standard 44.1 kHz FLAC or WAV file. The premise being that you could use an MQA-enabled DAC to then unfold the MQA-encoded audio and get back all of that extra bandwidth beyond what typical digital audio would allow. There were also claims that MQA was able to account for and counteract the alterations made by ADCs, the analog to digital converters used to actually record songs, but these claims, both the lossless and the counteraction one, were first disputed when Archimago and Mans Rulgard both provided separate independent testing to show that MQA's filters were leaky and were adding unwanted content to the fully unfolded MQA output that was never supposed to be there. Chris Conacher of Audiophile Style actually gave a talk about this at Rocky Mountain Audio Fest with some of the MQA directors present, and it got a little bit contentious. And these claims were further put into doubt when I published my video testing MQA. I actually published an album of music on Tidal with test signals hidden inside, so that then I could see exactly what MQA was doing to the audio I provided both before and after the unfolding process. I had to do this because originally MQA made it very difficult to test. Only labels and distributors had access to the actual MQA encoder. You couldn't just as a regular person convert music to MQA yourself, and they also didn't allow anyone with a digital output device, so like a digital streamer, to have the full MQA decoder, only analog output DACs. This then prevented anyone from being able to compare the fully unfolded MQA output to a high-res original and see if they were the same and actually lossless. My testing showed that MQA was not lossless. It was adding noise, distortion, and altering the phase of the music that I had provided, regardless of whether you were using an MQA-enabled DAC or not. And it also put heavily into doubt the claim of being able to correct for the recording equipment, because I got the MQA Studio certification despite the fact that I had never provided any information about what recording equipment had been used. Immediately after that video, MQA did scrub their website and marketing of some of these claims. They got rid of all the lossless claims and started focusing on being better than lossless, but the company later went bankrupt. However, they were recently acquired by Lenbrook, the parent company of NAD and Blue Sound, among some other brands. So I wanted to have a look at what has actually changed. Is it new, or is it just the same stuff with different marketing? Well, I bought Blue Sound's flagship streamer, the Node Icon, to find out, as this is one of the first products with MQA's new Qrono decoder inside. Let's have a look at MQA's website. Now, previously MQA was kind of one thing, a music format with a corresponding decoder, which they licensed to DAC and streamer manufacturers. In fact, the devs of the software program Rune, the music player software, mentioned that they actually had to pay MQA on a per decode basis, not just a fixed licensing fee. But now it seems that MQA, instead of being one thing, we have a few. We've got Focus, Qrono, and Aria. But these are seemingly just new names for different parts of what previously made up MQA, Focus being the encoder used to convert stuff to MQA, Qrono being the MQA renderer and decoder, and Aria being the Bluetooth codec, which was previously called MQAir, and before that, SCL6. That was, again, a thing before the company actually went bankrupt. Aria, the wireless streaming protocol, is not currently in any products at the moment, so I don't have too much to say about it because I can't test it. I don't know that there's necessarily any need for a new Bluetooth or wireless streaming protocol at the moment, because even for just Bluetooth, there are both adaptive and lossless, in fact, codecs available, so not sure if it's necessary, but once it comes out, I will give it a test. What I'm interested in at the moment is whether the core MQA components, Focus and Qrono, have actually changed. The big thing is that it seems that their promises of what MQA actually does have changed once again. There is no longer any mention on the website or in the white paper about it being a lossless compression mechanism. Good, because it wasn't. They scrubbed most of those claims almost immediately after my original video came out. But they also don't seem to be mentioning anything about any of the being able to correct for the behavior of recording equipment stuff anymore. The only line mentioning that is that this needs a different technology in the white paper. And I'm glad that they're also not making that claim, not only because my original testing showed that that almost certainly wasn't true, at least for the broadly available MQA product. Again, my music got the MQA Studio certification despite never asking for any info about what my recording equipment was, and also just most modern music is not recorded with one ADC. It's not produced in analog anymore. Stuff gets recorded with different ADCs for different instruments, and then there's all sorts of post-production stuff after that, which will affect things. But hey, that didn't stop Warner Music from batch converting almost their entire music library to MQA, regardless of the origin of the songs, and that then later resulted in artists like Neil Young actually pulling all of their music from Tidal in protest at it having been served in MQA without their input or permission. But anyway, that's a little bit besides the point. The new marketing centers around the Focus and Qrono oversampling filters being just plain better than what else is available, with claims of minimizing ringing and being more accurate in the time domain than regular DAC filters. So they seem to be focusing on the old de-blurring, which is mentioned both in this and some of the old MQA marketing material. But this doesn't really stack up for anyone that actually understands digital audio theory. This is all based upon the common misconception that an impulse response test for a DAC, for instance, that shows less ringing is better than one which shows more ringing. The thing is, the ringing on an impulse response is there as a result of the filter working. The ringing on an impulse response only appears in the presence of illegal or out-of-band signal content, and an impulse is a synthetically created, intentionally illegal signal that you cannot record in the real world because it contains all frequencies at equal level up to infinity, which is why it's used to test filter responses. When you want to test a filter, you want to feed it everything, including stuff that shouldn't be there, to see how it filters stuff out. And when you've got a lot of content that shouldn't be there and that needs to get filtered out, you get quite a lot of ringing. If you have less ringing on an impulse response, it means that the filter is not working properly. As a result, it's not possible to have a perfect square wave or a perfect impulse in a 44.1 kHz file because they need far higher bandwidths. We can actually show this if we take a clip from the amp classes video and play it in reverse. Here you can see what a real square wave looks like when observed with different bandwidths, turning from a perfect square wave to one that has ringing if you turn down the bandwidth a fair bit, and then if you cut off right above the fundamental, it looks like a sine wave. To get that perfect square wave, we have to have an almost infinite bandwidth because there are so many high frequency harmonics that have to be there to create that square wave. If you only have up to 22 kHz, then you're going to have ringing because you don't have sufficient bandwidth to describe a perfect square wave. But why do we actually need a filter in a DAC in the first place? Well, all of digital audio is based around something called Nyquist theorem, which states that you can perfectly reconstruct an analog signal from sampled data up to half your sampling rate. So for 44.1 kHz, that means you've got a bandwidth of up to 22.05 kHz. A lot of you guys will have heard that before, but many people aren't aware of the second aspect of this, which is that that is only true if you perfectly band limit, meaning filter out everything above half the sampling rate and leave everything below it untouched. This is why pretty much all DACs have oversampling filters. They are needed in order to actually reconstruct the original analog waveform from that PCM sampled digital data. But doing this perfectly is not possible. You would need infinite computing power. So you can only do what you can do with the available compute power. Some manufacturers like Chord, for instance, put a lot of resources and compute power towards having very high performance reconstruction filters. And as a result, looking at something like even the Chord Mojo 2 or the Chord Dave and M scaler, their filters cut off almost instantaneously at exactly half the sampling rate and leave everything below that untouched. Whereas most DACs with less compute power available, running more basic filters, will have a more gentle roll-off, meaning they either will slightly attenuate stuff in the audible band or won't quite fully attenuate by 22.05 kHz. But they've got the same goals, Chord's just doing a better job because they've got more compute power. MQA's claim is that it is actually better to have what in practice is a less effective filter that doesn't filter out as much and get less ringing. This goes against what basically all DAC manufacturers are doing. AKM, ESS, DCS, Chord, Texas Instruments, basically anyone else that I could name are all using filters which, for the most part, try to adhere to Nyquist theorem as best they can with the available compute power. So even for a fairly basic DAC like an SMSL Raw Pro DAC, just using an ESS chip, the filter response looks something like this. But this is the filter response of the blue sound node icon with MQA's new Qrono D2A. You can see that there is a lot of lingering stuff well above half the sampling rate of 22.05 kHz, and none of this stuff should be there. Let's have a look at the practical effects of this on a real signal. So I created a multi-tone test, just 32 tones going up to 20 kHz, so that it's not just a single sign in case anyone was worried about that. In fact, this is what the waveform looks like. It is a complex signal. And then this is what the original file looks like. this is what's contained in the original audio, and so a correct reconstruction of this should look exactly like that. It shouldn't be changing it, it shouldn't be attenuating high frequency stuff, and it shouldn't be adding anything that was not present in the original file. If we play this through a fairly standard DAC, again I'm going to use the SMSL Raw Pro DAC because it's got an oversampling filter which is pretty decent. It cuts off most stuff above the Nyquist frequency and does not attenuate high frequency stuff, and so at the output of the DAC we get basically exactly what we want. It is basically the same as the original file, nothing is being changed and nothing is being added besides whatever noise floor or distortion the DAC might inherently have, which has nothing to do with the filter itself. But if we then swap to the Blue Sound Node icon with its demonstrably less effective filter, this is what we get. Now there is suddenly a huge amount of unwanted stuff that was never present in the original file being added to the output of the device. This is a demonstrably less accurate reconstruction of what the original signal was supposed to be. But isn't it a trade-off? Surely there's an argument to be made, as MQA is making, that it's worth it to have less of that ringing. Well, the thing is, as I mentioned earlier, ringing only occurs in the presence of an illegal signal with frequency content beyond the Nyquist frequency. So something that was either synthetically created to have frequency content outside of that, like an impulse response, or a situation like where music is clipping, for instance, in which case you got bigger issues anyway. Also, ringing occurs at 22.05 kHz, so even if it does exist, you probably can't hear it anyway. But the point is, any real music or anything recorded with an ADC with a reasonable filter is almost certainly not going to have ringing because it doesn't have content beyond the Nyquist frequency. As it turns out, Nyquist was a pretty clever guy, and we can demonstrate that Nyquist theory works with a pretty simple test. Let's take our signal and upsampling it using something with a very, very steep Nyquist adherent filter that on an impulse response has tons of ringing, and then downsample it again and compare to the original and see what's changed. So I took the multitone signal and put it through PGGB, which is an upsampling tool that uses a filter with hundreds of millions of taps, hundreds of times more than even the chord M scaler does, and as a result of how fast and steep its filter cutoff is, it has tons of ringing on the impulse response. So this should be a good test to see if that ringing does become a problem. But when we take that high-res upsampled file with all the ringing and stuff supposedly added, and then just downsample and compare in delta wave, I'm not using PGGB again, two different tools just to be safe, we can see that the resulting output is 99.96% bit perfect against the original. Not just similar, not just audibly transparent, bit perfect. Absolutely identical data, all 24 bits, in almost every single sample to what we originally had. In fact, the only different bit was the first 0.1 seconds of the file, where there is some difference around minus 160 dB, and actually thinking now whilst recording, that's probably just where one of the tracks was slightly misaligned and was silent at the very beginning, so there's just a difference in noise floor between 24 and 32-bit. This is a simple practical demonstration that by doing what Nyquist theorem says, band limiting as perfectly as we possibly can with as steep a filter cutoff as we possibly can, we can transparently upsample, reconstruct, downsample, and convert the audio, and it is absolutely perfect if done right. All the frequency and timing information is the same. All the data is the same. Not just similar, not just audibly transparent, it is absolutely perfect. Whereas if we go with MQA's approach, then we get what looks like a nicer impulse response, but all we are doing is getting an inaccurate reconstruction. The lack of ringing is a result of the filter being ineffective and not filtering out the stuff that it should be filtering it out. This is a huge amount of erroneous content being added to our output signal. This is not accurate. It also seems that Qrono is basically just the same as the original MQA renderer filter with a different name. If we compare the filter response of Qrono D2A to the measurements I took when originally measuring the iFi Diablo, either with their GTO filter or when playing MQA content, they bear a very similar resemblance. So I'm honestly not even sure if Qrono is actually anything new or is literally just the MQA renderer filters with a new branding slapped on. And it is also now being applied to everything, regardless of whether you are actually playing MQA content in the first place. But then there is also Qrono DSD, and if we look at the webpage, it claims that Qrono DSD retains the time domain accuracy that DSD is known for, and this breakthrough method faithfully preserves the sound and quality of DSD recordings. DSD to PCM conversion is not talked about at all in their white paper, so there's no specific promises that I can go and check, but I can just compare some DSD content playing through the SMSL DAC with its bog standard ESS DSD to PCM conversion versus the Blue Sound node with its Qrono DSD. Let's see what we get. Taking our multitone test again so that we can clearly see what happens with a complex signal, I converted it to DSD and then just played it through both the Blue Sound node and the SMSL Raw DAC. This is the comparison of the output of the two. It looks like the Bluesound has a slightly higher overall noise floor, which is fine. That's not necessarily indicative of the DSD to PCM processing. It could be, but it could also just be that the device itself has a higher noise floor. But we can also see that the highest frequency tones have been slightly attenuated on the output of the Bluesound node versus the SMSL. So it seems that the Qrono DSD, or the Bluesound node, one of the two, for DSD content is slightly attenuating high frequency content. And if we look down towards the bottom of any of the individual tones, we can also see something else a little bit interesting. As well as just the Bluesound having a slightly higher noise floor overall, it also has a slightly wider stem around those tones. Now, this looks almost like phase noise, timing uncertainty. If you have something playing a single frequency with absolutely perfect unwavering timing, or a batch of frequencies with absolutely perfect unwavering timing, you'll see just the one spike for each frequency because it's absolutely perfect. But if your timing isn't perfect, either because of mediocre clocking or mediocre DSD to PCM and other DSP going on, then sometimes it'll be slightly too fast, thereby outputting a slightly higher frequency, and sometimes it'll be slightly too slow, thereby outputting a slightly lower frequency, which on the FFT then means we've got, as well as just the middle spike itself that it's supposed to be, a little bit of stuff either side. And on the Qrono DSD enabled device, we can see that there is more of that going on than on the SMSL. So on the Qrono DSD front, it seems that the bog standard ESS DSD to PCM conversion in the SMSL DAC is doing a better job. The only objective claim that they make on the Qrono DSD page is that Qrono DSD minimizes distortions, but demonstrably the non-Qrono device is doing a better job of that here. So if in future something comes out where you can toggle on or off the Qrono DSD processing to test on identical hardware, I would be happy to test again, but for now it seems that Qrono DSD is providing no advantage. I also just want to quickly say that if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, then as well as hitting the subscribe button down below, consider headphones.com for your next audio purchase. Whether you're looking for a DAC, amp, headphone, or some kind of accessory, or basically anything else at all, headphones.com makes everything that we do on this channel possible. So if you want to help support us, consider buying from headphones.com. Then I wanted to have a look at MQA files to see if, as well as what's going on with regular audio going through Qrono D2A or Qrono DSD, is the processing for MQA content actually any different? And it doesn't really seem that it is. Taking my original MQA test files from my earlier MQA test video, we can see that as well as the issues remaining with the actual file itself, where MQA had altered, added noise and distortion to the content before you even look at any kind of DAC, it still is doing the same thing where the original file had the impulse response, so the phase and signal content being altered. The MQA renderer and decoder still alters it further, and in fact the resulting impulse response looks basically identical to what I saw in my original testing. So does the filter response. Weirdly, the best fix for what MQA had done to my test files was actually to use HQ Player's polysync MQA filter, which is specifically designed to undo some of the aberrations created by MQA's encoder process. And even if you're just going by MQA's claims of minimizing ringing, or just getting rid of whatever is going on with this one, it seems that it's doing a better job. As to Focus, the new name for the MQA encoder, there aren't any products with that available yet, but ESS has announced that they are releasing some ADCs with Focus built in, so once some products with those available are out, I will give them a go and test. But it seems that for now, given as the behavior of the Bluesound node icon, both with and without MQA content, is very, very similar to previous testing that I did with products like the iFi IDSD Diablo and other MQA-enabled products, it does seem that the new MQA Qrono stuff is just the old MQA stuff with a new name. My personal opinion is that I am very glad that MQA is no longer making, quite frankly, ridiculous claims about what their product is and what it can do, and the fact that they're no longer making those claims should hopefully speak to some of the validity of those claims in the first place. But what they're saying in their white paper now is, rather than factual claims, more so just their opinion. They're saying that they think that shorter, less effective filters, which then do provide less ringing, are better. I personally disagree. It goes against Nyquist's theorem itself, and it goes against what basically every DAC manufacturer is doing. You would have thought that if clever companies like Texas Instruments, ESS, AKM, and just about everyone else had realized this, they would all be using similar filter designs. But the other thing is, if you do prefer shorter filters, or minimum phase filters for that matter, that's fine and you should be able to use them. Which you can, without paying for MQA. Most DACs will have an option to use a short filter and a minimum phase filter if you want. In fact, here is the impulse response for the short minimum phase filter on the SMSL DAC that I was testing with earlier, and this is the MQA filter in their white paper. You can do this for free. You don't need to buy MQA to do it, and it seems to me at the moment that MQA is basically just trying to monetize what they've got left in any way possible. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you've got any questions you wanted to ask about MQA, DACs, digital filters, or anything else at all, then come and say hey on the Headphones.com Discord server or the Headphones.com forum, where I and other wiggly air enthusiasts will endeavor to help. Till next time, I'm Golden Sound, you're watching The Headphone Show by Headphones.com. Thanks for watching.